talk today. So I'm very happy to be introducing to you our next guest speaker for this conference, Jozina Vander Klok. Jozina is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Oslo, and she's about to start a postdoc at Humboldt University in Berlin. She completed her PhD at McGill, where she wrote her dissertation on tense aspect and modal markers in Pachiran Javanese, where even the title of her dissertation combines many of her longtime interests in linguistics, so syntax, semantics, tense aspect modality, as well as, of course, as the Javanese language. She's worked on a variety of topics throughout her career. This includes her main focus on TAM, syntax, and semantics, like, for example, her work on modality in Javanese, or the question of how to tell apart the perfect from the meaning of already, or a number of other interesting questions that she's asked about it. But she's also published on a number of other topics like prosodic focus in English and French, the structure of little VP, methodology in semantic fieldwork, as well as work that she's done geared towards language conservation. Her work's been published in journals including Glossa and NLT, Semantics and Pragmatics, and Oceanic Linguistics. So what she'll be talking to us about today is what Javanese tells us about types of ellipsis in polar answers. So please join me in welcoming Jozina.
Thanks, Mathieu, for a really nice introduction, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me, and as well as making this conference as accessible as we can, given the pandemic. My only regret is that I can't attend the odd number blocks because it's in the middle of the night for me. But yeah, I'm obviously thrilled to be at AFLA. It holds a special place in my heart. It was the first conference that I co-organized, and as well the first conference that I attended as a graduate student. And I always try to come to AFLA, even with a 4-month-old baby once. Okay, let's go to types of ellipsis in polar answers now. All right. So the background of this talk is looking at what Javanese, as Mathieu mentioned in the title, can tell us about types of ellipsis in polar answers. And the polar answer type that I'll be interested in is what is called repetition type polar answers, where answers repeat the same content, such as a verb or an auxiliary, as a polar question, but this is just a fragment. So an example from Holmberg's work on Finnish is illustrated in 1. In answer to the question, did Jussi buy that book? You can answer with the inflected verb as an affirmative answer. In Javanese, which is a Western Malayo-Polynesian language spoken on the island of Java in Indonesia, there are 2 types of repetition affirmative polar answers with a TAM auxiliary. So this is illustrated in 2. So in answer to the question, can Kuna'a swim? You can answer with the auxiliary only as an A1, iso, using repeating the same modal, which is glossed as circumstantial possibility, so literally can, or what I'll call subject auxiliary answers, so where you repeat both the subject and the auxiliary, kuna'a, iso, and A2. Here I've illustrated with one modal. There are a number of different, one auxiliary, there are a number of different auxiliaries in the variety, well, all varieties of Javanese, and the variety that I'll be focusing on comes from fieldwork that I've done on almost the past 10 years of an East Javanese variety from Pachiran spoken in the Lamongan region. And these include a tense marker, tau, different modals, possibility modals, iso, ole, a necessity modal, kutu, as well as different aspectual markers. I will be putting, because I'm only focusing on affirmative answers, I will be putting aside durung, not yet. And we will see that ape, this prospective aspect marker, behaves exceptional. So just keep that in mind. of course, this is the only possibility of answering affirmatively. You can use also the full clause subject with the basic word order, subject, auxiliary, verb, object, or with a yes, no particle and non or gestural like head nods or shaking. So the yes, no particles and the head nods or gestures are what Enfield et al. Term interjective type, but I will be focusing on the repetition type polar answers. Okay, so I assume that the repetition type polar answers have a full underlying syntactic clause structure. And in Holmberg's 2016 book, using a cross-linguistic survey of over 100 languages, he identifies two main strategies for verb or auxiliary only answers. What I'm going to call them is IP domain ellipsis as one type and VP ellipsis, and then plus subject ellipsis or pro drop. So IP domain, you are eliding a larger constituent, which includes the polarity phrase, and you'll notice that the auxiliary or verb, whatever moves, is high in the left periphery. This is compared to VP ellipsis, where the auxiliary verb remains low. If you have the verb, it would be verb stranding, verb phrase ellipsis, plus prodrop or subject ellipsis. So variation cross-linguistically, we can ask, does the verb auxiliary move in the language? If so, where to? Can it move high? Does the language have prodrop or argument ellipsis? Does the language have VP ellipsis? So this paper that I'm talking about today is couched within this larger framework of looking at the phenomena in the language and how it fits into the landscape of possible derivations for fragment answers. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, there's two types of repetition affirmative answers, auxiliary only and subject auxiliary. And in principle, and here's the puzzle, either derivation is possible for both auxiliary only and subject auxiliary answers, since Javanese independently has the right properties. So it has auxiliary movement, it has VP ellipsis, and it has argument ellipsis. So with, of course, auxiliary only would have a subject ellipsis as well, and subject auxiliary answer with the IP domain would have to have additionally subject movement. So we can illustrate this with, so IP domain ellipsis, if this was the strategy used across these two types of polar answers, in both cases, the auxiliary is high in a left periphery, and additionally for the subject plus auxiliary answer, the subject moves, say, to a topic position above focus. And then for verb phrase ellipsis, this is compatible with both answers, types of answers where the auxiliary remains low, where for auxiliary only, you have both VPE and subject ellipsis. Whereas for subject to auxiliary answers, only the verb phrase ellipsis occurs. So what I will argue in this talk is that A1 auxiliary only and A2 subject auxiliary answers actually use two distinct strategies. And I propose that auxiliary only answers use what I term IP domain ellipsis, where the auxiliary has moved to a focus position in the left periphery, and then this polarity phrase is elided under identity with a polarity phrase of the polar question. Now, what I found interesting in doing this research is that I'm going to argue that A2 answers don't use either IP domain ellipsis or VPE. Instead, what I'll argue for is that it uses a VP topic drop via a matching analysis. And so I'm extending an analysis put forward by Toms and Wacht in 2019 to English VP pre-posing. So in this derivation, crucially, it differs on a number of counts. So the auxiliary is in its base position, there's no movement. And there's two VPs that are base generated. The lower VP is elided under identity with the higher base generated VP. And there's a null operator that is base generated with the subject of the lower VP, which moves to a position above the higher base generated VP and links these two VPs, which results in the same subject. And then different from overt VP fronting or VP preposing, this higher base generated VP is elided under identity with the polar question. So there's this tactic relation there. Okay, so I'm first going to talk about the derivation for subject auxiliary only, and then as IP domain ellipsis, and then look at subject auxiliary answers as VP ellipsis or VP topic drop via matching, and then conclude. So the basic arguments that I'm going to put forward for auxiliary only answers as IP domain ellipsis are arguing that we have evidence for that the auxiliary is high, and then I'm going to put forward evidence, argue against the analysis of VPE plus subject ellipsis. Okay, so the first piece of evidence that auxiliary only answers are derived as IP domain ellipsis comes from overt auxiliary movement to a position in the left periphery from full clauses. This is illustrated in 3. So the same question as before, can kuna'a swim, of course in Javanese, and the answer, iso koyo e kuna'a ngangi. Here you see that the tam auxiliary is above an epistemic or an evidential adverb, and in the tree, it must take IP or TP as its scope, and so you'll see I've put it on the specifier of mood P, for example. And what's interesting about this word order is that it's completely unexpected in other environments. It's in fact ungrammatical in any other environment except in answers to polar questions. So this provides evidence that the auxiliary can be independent evidence that the auxiliary is high. And so here I go through some other data points to show you that the data are indeed robust. This unexpected TAM word order is found with different combinations of TAM auxiliaries and epistemic or evidential adverbs. So in answer in 4, here we have the root necessity modal have to or must, which occurs above the direct evidential marker adverb kedoe. In 5, we have the same example as before, but with different adverbs. So the same modal, iso, but with epistemic possibility modals, mungkin or paling, as well as other evidentials, koyo e jikane. In 6 and 7, this illustrates the with different TAM auxiliaries, with POW, the past tense marker, and with ole. And you might have noticed that sometimes the polar questions are a little bit different. This does not seem to matter in licensing this unexpected word order. Okay, so the upshot of these data is that TAM auxiliaries can independently be in a high position above TP and polar answers. Okay, a second piece of evidence for a higher position of auxiliaries is that auxiliaries seem to have the same role as yes/no particles in full sentence answers if you have an emphatic type answer. So under a movement analysis, these TAM auxiliaries can be considered as realizations of multiple copies. So in an example in 8, in answer to the question, can Arif not eat for 2 days? And Arif's wife responds, Iso, pa Arif iso gat mangan rong dino. So yes, Mr. Arif is able to not eat for 2 days. And so here we can see that there's the modal can be repeated, and it is in complementary distribution with the yes/no particle. And this can be likened to what Martins looks at in European Portuguese for emphatic affirmation. And she argues that these two instances of the inflected verb are realizations of multiple copies. Okay, so what about auxiliary only answers about the possibility that they're derived by VPE and subject ellipsis? So a first piece of evidence is that is based on the distribution of TAM markers. So in VP ellipsis, you can have all auxiliaries being compatible with a verb phrase with ellipsis, including the aspectual marker ape, which I think is a prospective aspect. So this is illustrated in 10. Adi will graduate from high school and Putri yo ape. However, when looking at auxiliary only answers, answering with ape is completely out. So will nunung bake cake ape masak kue. Speakers judge this as ungrammatical. And in fact, when we look at a wider range of syntactic contexts, ape, this prospective aspect marker, is also ungrammatical with narrow focus using the focus marker to, as well as focus fronting above a mood adverb. So the examples I showed previously with the unexpected word order is not possible with ape, but it is possible with all the other auxiliaries. So this ungrammaticality with ape is consistent with that auxiliary only answers are in a higher position, a high focus position, and derived via IP domain ellipsis. A second piece of evidence against VPE plus subject ellipsis focuses on the subject ellipsis part. So we know that subject ellipsis is independently possible in Javanese, and in polar questions without a TAM marker, as in 12, sampean manganto, are you eating? It's not possible to answer with the verb alone. So it's not possible to simply say mangan. So subject ellipsis seems impossible in this environment. Therefore, it follows that the polar questions with TAM markers are also not derived by subject ellipsis and VPE. However, I will point out that once you add, the speakers repair this by adding a yes, no particle. So you can say iyo mangan. So this is something that I'd like to follow up with. But at least we also have evidence from the distribution with TAM markers that auxiliary only answers behave differently than VPE. Okay, so here I'll summarize the supporting evidence. We independently have evidence that auxiliary moves to the left periphery above a evidential or epistemic adverb with full answers. There's a realization of multiple copies. And then against the subject ellipsis and VP analysis, the VPE analysis predicts that APE, the prospective marker, should be possible, but it's not. And subject ellipsis is not possible, at least in verb-only answers. Okay, let's turn now to the subject auxiliary answers. So, so here recall that I'm arguing for a derivation that is neither like auxiliary only as IP domain ellipsis, but also not a VPE analysis, but instead a matching analysis. And the main arguments that I'm going to be putting forward are that subject auxiliary answers share the same licensing conditions as overt VP preposing in Javanese. So there's a specific set of TAM markers that occur in this in both these constructions, and they're also very restricted in the syntactic environment. And these are both restricted in comparison to verb phrase ellipsis. And then I will argue against an IP domain ellipsis. And in this case, the subject will also have to move to get the subject auxiliary answer. And the main piece of evidence here is that it predicts the wrong word order possibilities when we look at mood adverse. Excuse me. Okay, so let's look at the distribution of TAM markers across different constructions. So this goes back to my dissertation, and I'm still working on this. But so the observation is that subject auxiliary answers share the same licensing conditions with their TAM auxiliary distribution as with overt VP preposing. So you can see that only a subset, namely the past tense marker and root possibility modals, isol and ole, like can or may in Javanese, are possible in these constructions. All the other auxiliaries are out. And this differs. I've just shown you that auxiliary only answers are possible with all auxiliaries except for APE, which for some reason is not licensed in focus contexts. And it also differs from VP ellipsis, which allows for all auxiliaries. So just looking at this distribution before we get to the data, this argues against a verb phrase ellipsis analysis. Of course, without further requirements, one would have to say why the root necessity and these aspectual markers are not licensed with VPE in these contexts, but they are in VPE. And then, sorry, I just have to move. Let's see here. And then it also argues against an IP domain ellipsis analysis, again, without further requirements saying why at least kutulake and wis are ungrammatical in this domain. So let's look at the data. So subject auxiliary answers, ISO is a possibility. Here I'm illustrating the auxiliary and the subject auxiliary, but then lage is possible as a sub-auxiliary only answer, but it's not possible when the subject is overt. So is Nana cooking or starting to cook? Javanese speakers can't answer with unana lage. And then when we compare it to overt VP preposing, we find the same distribution. So in 14, you can it's possible to have lift the stone, holikan with iso, but in 15, buying rice, patsuanan lage, that's impossible. Okay. Here we compare ole and kutu. So in here I've just given the subject auxiliary answers. So in 16, in answer to, sorry, wrong, copy paste error, salsa, may salsa buy the new skirt? It's possible to answer salsa ole, but it's not possible to have the same structure with kutu. So in 17, does Ali have to pay the fine? Mr. Ali kutu is not a possible answer. Similarly, this distribution is found with overt VP preposing. So wear pants to ngaji, Josie ole is fine, but bayar dendo, pay a fine, gayus kutu, gayus must is out. Okay, then I also show this same distribution with the past tense marker. So it's possible in a subject auxiliary answer and with VP preposing, but the aspectual marker already with is is ungrammatical in both the subject auxiliary answer and in overt VP preposing. Okay. Now you might be wondering about Johnson's 2001 paper, which has argued for VP movement feeding ellipsis, where VP preposing is then the higher, the preposed VP is deleted, and that's what gets you VP ellipsis in English. So what if we could use this same idea in Javanese, where the movement, if we take VP preposing to be overt movement, and that feeds into the ellipsis of subject auxiliary answers. Well, in the spirit of Toms and Walkden, under a hypothesis that VP preposing is a bar movement, the licensing conditions on VP preposing would have to be different from other A bar movement. So no such conditions exist for topicalization of arguments or adjuncts. For example, P stranding is ungrammatical in licensing WH questions in Javanese. But a possible counter argument is that, well, maybe VPs are just very different than DPs and PPs. So I wanted to look at another piece of evidence that might suggest that VP preposing is not feeding ellipsis, and in support of a matching analysis. So, and this comes from what kinds of environments VP preposing and subject auxiliary answers occur in comparison with VP ellipsis. So here I've given two examples of VP ellipsis in 24 and 25 in Javanese, and there's no discourse requirement such as being embedded under a question that licenses VP ellipsis. VP ellipsis is also licensed in embedded context as well as in syntactic islands, whereas VP preposing and subject auxiliary answers seem to be only licensed as answers. So they're much more restricted in the set of syntactic environments. So here's one example comparing VP ellipsis to VP preposing. So in 26 is an example of VP ellipsis in embedded context. So I thought Ipul hung the clothes to dry, but my mother thinks that Ipul did not. So here Ipul or negation thou is embedded under the my mother thought. And so VPE is possible. However, VP preposing does not seem to be possible in embedded context. So I tried to do this under a question where you have the overt VP preposing, and here's the embedded. I said that Siti can help the student that is taught by Mr. Jono, and where help the student that is taught by Mr. Jono is preposed. I don't have an example where it's preposed underneath the matrix verb. So that could be possible, one thing to explore. But what I will say is that even in examples that when I was first looking at this, where I didn't have a discourse context, clues that speakers gave was that they supplied a yes/no question to allow for overt VP preposing to be felicitous. So sorry, just to back up, if we go to this slide, yeah. We can say that since they're in a subset of environments compared to VP ellipsis, it doesn't make sense that VP ellipsis would, or movement feeding this cannot then be generalized in any way to then account for VP ellipsis, which occurs in different environments. Okay, so here I will provide some arguments, or one argument against the analysis of the IP domain ellipsis plus necessary topic movement of the subject. So recall that subject auxiliary type answers could have a similar derivational strategy as auxiliary only answers, namely that the auxiliary is high in both cases, and then with subject auxiliary answers, there's necessarily movement of the subject to a higher position, say topic. And I will show that evidence from the word order of auxiliaries and mood adverbs suggests that IP domain ellipsis is not used for subject auxiliary answers in Javanese. And so this is an additional argument beyond the distribution of TAM auxiliaries that I mentioned before. So the idea is that if subject auxiliary type answers were derived as IP domain ellipsis, the auxiliary is necessarily moving to a high position in the left periphery, the focus position. And this obligatory movement predicts that mood adverbs cannot be located above focus P in subject auxiliary answers. So recall the full sentence examples. We had this unexpected word order, so we would not predict that IP domain ellipsis would allow the order subject, mood, adverb, auxiliary in answers. But this is not borne out. So in 28 and 29, these are examples of both overt VP preposing, where you have the order subject, adverb, auxiliary, as well as the subject auxiliary answers, but with the insertion of the mood adverb. And this is illustrated in with the modals ISO as well as with tau. And both of these are possible, but and then just to follow up with the distribution of TAM markers in these environments, we also see that the progressive or incipient aspect marker laguet is ungrammatical in both VP preposing and subject auxiliary answers. So this provides a second argument that IP domain ellipsis plus a potential topic movement of the subject does not derive subject auxiliary answers in Javanese. Okay, so I've proposed that Javanese subject auxiliary answers uses a different analysis from auxiliary only answers, and extended Thomson-Wachten's proposal for overt VP preposing to answers where both base generated VPs are elided. And the summary of supporting evidence that I just went through is the following. So in support of this analysis is that subject auxiliary answers share the same licensing conditions as VP preposing, and which are the distribution of TAM markers, as well as the restricted syntactic environment. And these are both restricted compared to verb phrase ellipsis. So of the VP movement feeding ellipsis cannot be generalized in any way to also account for VP ellipsis. Then against IP domain ellipsis plus topic movement of the subject, I provided a second argument in addition to the distribution of TAM markers that it predicts the wrong word order possibilities with mood adverbs. Okay, so now I'd like to conclude with some wider implications of the Javanese data. So as I've mentioned, these two types of repetition answers are argued to have two distinct strategies. So auxiliary only as IP domain ellipsis, and subject auxiliary answers as VP topic trop via a matching analysis where both VPs are base generated. Overall, this adds to the syntactic typology of how polar answer types are derived, and widens the diversity of VP ellipsis as a matching analysis. So this is proposed for Thomson-Wachten for overt VP preposing, and they also speculate that English tag questions and emphatic retorts involve ellipsis and are amenable to a similar matching analysis. So 31 is an example of the emphatic retort answer. And they argue that this is amenable to the matching analysis because of three things. So in answers, the polarity particle encodes an anaphoric dependency between the elided constituent and the antecedent. So this is how you can get the higher VP eliding. And the ellipsis process is obligatory with a specific intonational contour in English. Thirdly, the subject of the elided clause co-varies with the subject of the antecedent clause. Okay. But what is interesting in the Javanese case is that neither type of answer, auxiliary only or subject to auxiliary answer, uses the VP ellipsis plus argument, optionally argument ellipsis as a strategy despite their independent availability. So VP ellipsis occurs in Javanese with contrastive subjects plus an additive particle or contrastive subjects and predicates, whereas VP preposing and subject auxiliary answers require subject matching. So this difference further suggests that information structure mapping is crucial to understand how the different ellipsis strategies are licensed. And this is something that I'd like to follow up on. And I'll just leave this data here, but it can be tricky because the same auxiliary split is also found. I just only have preliminary data with a smaller number of speakers. When we look at subject auxiliary fragment answers to content questions in Javanese. So in answer to a subject question, WH question, like in 32, who is sewing that shirt? Soposeng lage njait rak itu. You can't have a subject auxiliary answer, I aku lage, but you can with a different TAM marker iso, and the same distribution is shown. So who can drive a motorbike? Soposeng iso nyo pir sepeda motor, aku iso. So what is common across both is that they're both answers, but they're different in that it's a content question and not a polar answer. So this is something to pursue. Okay, so I will end here. Thank you so much, Matur nuan. And I would also like to conclude by acknowledging all the speakers that I've worked with, and thank you, special thanks to them for sharing their language with me, and especially to Fina, Titis, Ulum, Difa, and Wuri. I also like to thank UIO Linguistics and funding for being able to do fieldwork, which I hope I will be able to in the future. Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's thank our speaker for the great talk. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So as always, you can either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can write them in the chat and I'll read them out for you. Zhang, go ahead.
Thanks for the talk. I just have a small clarification question regarding the second argument for the first part. I think it's around page 14.
Okay. Let me just do like this.
Right. So this argument is saying the ESO behaves like yes, that's why it's probably somewhere in the IP domain or even higher. I was just wondering, just by looking at the answer in 8, how do we know it's not bi-clausal? So first you do can, then you say the rest of the sentence. Yeah. I guess one way to tell if this is possible is to see if you can have mismatches. You say can, then you have a different way of expressing. Right, yeah.
Yeah, great question. And reading the literature, I've also wondered about this myself. How can you, when does one clause end and when does the other one start if it is biclausal? I don't have data of the mismatch, and I like that idea. Yeah, and this would be interesting because in general, you can't have mismatches even when it's semantically plausible, like using already instead of the past tense marker. That's impossible in answering. But as for the example in 8, I don't have so many. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
We got a question from Mitchell.
Thank you, Jozina. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about sort of maybe what you currently think or how we should think about the restrictions on which TAM markers are available with the subject docs answers and with the VP proposing, right? So I feel somewhat convinced by the parallels that you show distributionally, right? That's really striking, I think, but I wish, at least maybe you understand, but I don't. I wish I understood what governed, that split. And could you tell us a little bit more about maybe how we can think about that?
So that's the $1 million question, at least in my mind. So a bit of history. Cole et al. 2008 first looked at this, and I was inspired by their paper. And they provide an analysis, because you also find the split in subject auxiliary inversion in yes/no questions. And so they just all looked at that contrast and say that, oh, it's due to the fact that these ones, tau, isol, and ale, are low in the structure, and because at the time they are, well, it's argued to be a perfect marker, tau. And they also have a feature, a story based on features that allows lower ones to move past the higher ones, or to just be attracted, because the higher ones do block the lower ones. And then in my dissertation, I looked at this more and proposed an analysis looking at wider syntactic environments, that there's both a feature property story and this anti-locality story under a phase between the lower and the high ones. But then I was still not satisfied by this answer and was thinking, so I took some time off on the syntax side and decided to look more on the semantics of individual markers. And what was striking in looking at this marker, I have a paper with Siwei Chen, Hotze Roman, and Lisa Mathewson that argues this is a past tense marker and against a perfect analysis, and it's a specific type of past tense marker. So this shows that tau is actually high in the structure, and it's not this syntax bifurcation that the possible ones are low and the impossible ones are high. So more recently, what I would like to speculate is that what's interesting to me is that these all have existential semantics. So tau is an existential past tense, isol and ale are possibility modals. And whereas the other ones don't have existential. And maybe there's separate reasons why they're ungrammatical. Like they seem to behave as a group, but they're individually just ungrammatical for individual reasons. Yeah, so that's my speculation right now. It could have to do with their existential properties, but then I'm also working a bit on restructuring context. And so I'd like to pursue what types of complements these markers allow in comparison to the aspectual ones.
That's all really exciting. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
There's a question from Matt Pearson.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I had just a clarification question on a small technical detail of your structure A2,
Yes.
which is, yeah, if you go to slide, 19, or slide 20. So you say that a null operator base generated with the subject of the lower VP moves to a position above the topic P and links the two VPs. I was wondering if you could just elaborate on that a little bit. I'm not sure where this operator is starting out exactly, where it's moving to, and why we need to have that operator there.
Okay. So I'm adopting this from Tom and Walkden's paper, and they likened it to an analysis in tough constructions. So the motivation is to provide an A binder for the pro in the higher base generated VP. So this this involves a bar movement of the operator to a higher position, but feeds into binding the pro, which will result in the subject matching in overt VP pre-posing in
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so that's the technical thing from Tom's and Walkden that I'm arguing, but I don't have a specific reason beyond that I'm just adopting it wholesale.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering why pro needs to be bound at all. It could be an arbitrary pro. So maybe the interpretation is something like, as for pro arb swimming, Kuna'a can do that thing. If you can get this kind of construction as an answer to a content question, like who can swim, that might suggest that if you're able to do this topicalization and topic drop in answer to a content question, that might suggest to me that the thing that's sitting in that topic position is kind of interpreted as as an unsaturated predicate. Kind of thingy. So I'm not sure that it would need to, be bound by something that's going to ensure that it has the same, that pro has the same referent as Kuna'a.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's just an idea. So
okay,
but
yeah.
I haven't read Tom's and Walkden, so I don't know their motivation. But thank you.
Well, they're in their 50 plus page paper, it's only mentioned at the very beginning and then they don't talk about it further. So this could be something to explore. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Oh.
We've got 4 minutes left for questions, so don't be shy. We've got a question from Hiroki Nomoto.
Yeah, thank you, Jozina. So I was listening to your talk, wondering what would be the corresponding Malay expressions. And at first I thought your subject auxiliary answer is impossible in Malay, but then I noticed that it is possible, but you need a specific context, and also this kind of answers involve a particular prosody, which is different from normal yes/no questions. So I wonder whether you noticed anything about interpretational differences between the two types of answers, and any kind of prosodic differences. I think this also relates to the point that you cannot answer just with eat, but you can eat becomes possible with yes. Or I wonder if it's also possible with other things like or interjections. So that's my question: prosody and interpretation. Any thoughts?
Yeah. In terms of interpretation, not so far. Yeah, but there is, as you mentioned, a specific prosody contour where the TAM marker is like lengthened. And you don't have to lengthen the auxiliary, the TAM auxiliary in auxiliary only answers. So where's the examples at the very beginning? So you can just answer iso, but in subject auxiliary answers, it's kuna'a iso is the typical from a non-native Javanese speaker, where you do find lengthening. But yeah, I agree. I'd be curious to know if there's other specific polar answer types that you can, or polar questions that only license one or the other. And so far I haven't found that.
Yep, okay, thank you.
We've got like 30 seconds left. So I see Michio has a question in the chat, but I'm thinking maybe you can talk about this during the break or on Slack so we can stick to the schedule. So let's thank our speaker once again.